Hello and welcome. Studies suggest that if you're human, there's a chance that you may or may not be an introvert or an extrovert. If so, is one better than the other? I'm Adam, and this is Adam Answers Anything. Welcome to the show. All right. Welcome to Adam Answers Anything. If you're joining us and you've been following the show for a while, you'll notice that there's a little bit of difference in the layout. It's because I'm using a new software. It's a software that I've used before-ish, but this is the first time I'm using it for the live stream. So it's OBS, which I don't remember what that stands for. I mean, something broadcast system, software, or something like that. But it's a free software, and I can live stream to YouTube and have this overlay at the same time. And so I wanted to give it a shot. Mostly because it's free. But anyway, welcome. I'm Adam. This is Adam Answers Anything. I answer anything, not because I know everything. I certainly don't. There's like everything that I don't know. There's a lot that I don't know. But I more so love wrestling with difficult questions. I love tackling topics and conversations and things that make you stop and think. And so that's why the show is called Adam Answers Anything, although the long title is Adam Answers Absolutely Anything at All, because I love alliteration. Today we have our 18th episode, so welcome. If you didn't catch our episode last week, you missed our Halloween episode where I shared some of the stories from my life about paranormal experiences, because it's Halloween. And so if you want to check that out, feel free to go check that out on the channel last week. If you're also listening to this, I do have this show published in a podcast format on Spotify, on Apple, I believe also Amazon, which I forget that they have a podcast thing. And also obviously YouTube, you can listen to it as well if you listen to podcasts there. So two quick things before we dive into our question for today, which is the format, by the way, of Adam Answers Anything. I usually have a question of the day, and the question is something that we kind of dive into. We break it apart. We kind of deep dive into a question and the themes that are encircle that question. Two quick things before we dive into today. First thing is, if you see this QR code up here in the corner, you can scan this QR code and it will take you to a form that you can fill out. And that form is going to give you an opportunity to submit a question to the show. And so if you submit a question to the show, I'll wrestle with that question and I'll make that question an episode on Adam Answers Anything. Another thing that it can do is it can give you an opportunity to actually select if you want to be on the show, which I would really love. I would love for you to be on the show so that I could talk through a question that you might have together. So if that interests you, go ahead and scan the QR code. If you have a perspective on any of the questions that I wrestle with in any of the episodes, I would love to hear that as well. So please, please, please leave a comment. As always, like and subscribe. Know that it helps the show, that it helps YouTube's mysterious algorithm to realize that, people actually want to listen or watch this. So like and subscribe, but more importantly, comment. Leave your perspective on the question, whatever the question might be. I would love to hear what you have to say. I would love to hear what your thoughts are. If you're watching live, leave a comment in the chat. I would love to see you, or I'd love to meet you. I'd love to greet you. I'd always love to hear from the people, the listeners that listen to the show. You guys are awesome, and so I'd love to hear from you. But like I said, today is our 18th episode, and it is a Wednesday. You might be thinking, but Adam, you said you're going to start doing shows regularly on Friday. I know. I've changed it around like 5 bazillion gazillion times. Well, hear me out. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of them obviously is because I can't make up my mind. But there's also a lot going on, right? in between starting the show and our 18th episode, my wife and I have like had a baby. So that's kind of thrown a wrench, not a wrench, but like it's thrown a consistent schedule into a whirlwind. Our baby's not a wrench. She's a beautiful little being. She's precious and we love her. But so having it consistently on Fridays was like, oh, it's kind of working. I tried Thursdays. Okay, well, let's try Wednesday. And the reason I wanted to do Wednesday is just because Friday nights tend to be a tricky time because there tends to be like events that I know that my wife and I will want to be a part of down the road. And those typically happen on Friday nights. And so I thought, okay, let's do it on a night where I know that like there aren't going to be any future events that I'm going to want to go to on a regular basis. Plus Wednesday, according to the mysterious algorithm and analytics and whatnot, so Wednesday tends to be a time where a lot of people that happen to watch my content are online. And so I thought, okay, well, Wednesday is good because Wednesday is kind of like in the middle of the week. Like when it's in the middle of the work week, I'm usually thinking, man, it's Wednesday. We're almost to the weekend. So it's kind of like a nice respite to have it on the week, in the middle of the week. Just kind of like something that you can listen to, or something that you could watch, just to kind of like fill that time, just to keep your mind occupied, to help just give you that push through the rest of the week. So that's why I'm doing it on a Wednesday. If it works out, I'm going to keep doing it regularly. Honestly, I know I said this about Friday. I apologize, but I'm probably going to stick to Wednesdays. And I am going to just prove that by sticking to it. And so here we are. And we have got a really great episode today, dealing a bit with personality. The question for today is, which is better, introvert or extrovert? That's a very interesting question. Which is better, introverts or extroverts? Two very important points before we begin that I'm going to dive into these points a little bit later. Introvert or extrovert, introverts or extroverts aren't necessarily better than one another. Like there is no better or best or worst. These categories of human personality and experience aren't one or the other. They're different ways of experiencing the world. So comparing them in this way is no more helpful than comparing an apple to an orange. They're two different things. Sure, they're both fruits, just like they're both personality types, but they're very different fruits, and it's meaningless to try and compare them to each other. The second thing is that these are not exclusive categories. See, most people, in fact, can't be categorized so simply or so to say. And I'd say, like, all people, you can't categorize so simply, so obviously, just nonchalantly, like, oh, well, you're either this or you're either that. Carl Jung himself once said that there is no such thing as a pure extrovert or a pure introvert. Such a man would be in a lunatic asylum. I think he's right about that. So those are 2 points I just want to make before we dive into this. So where do the terms even come from? So we talk about introvert, we talk about extrovert. I feel like a lot of us just kind of know what those mean, but where did they come from? Well, they came from the early 20th century. In 1921, Carl Jung popularized the terms introvert and extrovert as central building blocks to personality. Jung, an introvert himself, noted that introverts are drawn to the inner world of thoughts and feelings. I always have this image of just this person just kind of cozied up in a big old blanket next to a window, and it's snowing outside, and they've got their tea or coffee and their little Kindle or book, and they're just kind of like reading. That's kind of like the extremely cliche vision that I get of what an introvert is. Extroverts, on the other hand, crave the internal or the external world of people and activities. I always get this picture in my mind of this guy or girl at a party, and like everyone's just kind of standing around, and they're like in the middle, just like talking to everybody, like hello, 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 hello. That's like the image I get of extroverts. You might get a different image. I'd love to hear what kind of image do you get when someone says the word introvert or someone says the word extrovert? I'd love to know. But is there evidence to support Jung's theory? So in other words, is there evidence that extrovert and introvert are like sufficient categories of explaining different psychological or personality types. I mean, is this an actual true thing, or is this just like something that he just kind of made up, didn't really have like evidence for? Well, 3 levels of proof. We're going to talk about these really quickly. EEG studies, so electroencephalogram. These are like those little, little things that they put on the brain, on your scalp, kind of measures brain waves. This is Gale et al. This is in 1983. And they did this in 1993 as well, so they did this twice. It found that introverts often show higher brain activity at rest and stronger responses to sensory input. A 2001 study by Johnson et al., again, found that introverts had stronger blood flow in the frontal lobes, linked to planning and internal processing, while extroverts had more blood flow in the temporal lobes, linked to sensory processing. Interesting. In other words, introverts tend to have higher baseline cortical arousal, especially in the reticular activating system of the brainstem, and extroverts have a lower baseline arousal, which may drive them to seek external stimulation to reach their optimal arousal level. So what does this mean? Okay, I'm talking about cortical arousal, reticular activating systems. Extroverts have a lower baseline. What does this mean? Well, this is kind of a good way. I'm going to kind of go into like a little bit of an example. Introverts tend to have their baseline arousal is low. If you think about it like a car, like an engine. So if I turn on the car and I'm just letting it idle, right? So it's in park and it's just idling. That engine's still, the pistons are still spinning. The pistons are still firing, I should say. And the engine's still functioning, even though I'm not driving it. It has a lower RPM because I'm not pushing gas pedal. The RPM that it has when it's sitting idle would be your baseline. So that's the baseline of the idling of a car. It's the baseline RPM of a car. Likewise, when you're just not being stimulated in whatever way, not stimulated with social activity or not really stimulated by, engaging conversation or anything like that, your baseline cortisol or cortical arousal level, your baseline is like the baseline RPMs of a car when it's sitting idle. Now, for introverts, that RPM or that cortical arousal level, that their baseline is high enough so that it's sufficient for them to be satiated. Or I guess another way to put it is it's sufficient enough for that engine to keep running perfectly fine and perfectly smooth, I should say. And so things like social interactions, right? For an introvert, things like social interactions, noise, activity, or overwhelming like social situations and conversations tend to lower the RPM of an introvert. Their baseline cortical arousal tends to lower it, whereas in an extrovert, things like parties and conversation and energetic environments tends to stimulate it, bringing it up even more. Because extroverts actually they're a bit quieter. Extroverts' brains have a lower RPM, baseline RPM, just like that engine, than an introvert does. So they turn to the outside world for energy. So when they're idle, an extrovert's brain has a lower cortical arousal level, just like they have a lower RPM if their brain's an engine. So they need external input in order to increase that RPM so that their cortical arousal level hits that sufficient baseline and they're calm, they're satiated. Their brain is functioning smoothly and it's satiated. When they don't get that external input, then the RPM continues to decrease. Introverts are naturally more active, are inwardly active, and so they tend to be more calm because their baseline RPM is sufficient. Okay, I hope we understand that. I feel like I belabored that point a little bit. But that's the first study. The second one is research by DePue and Collins from 1999 connected extroversion with dopamine sensitivity and reward motivation. Conley in 2002 used fMRI, a magnetic resonance imaging. If you've ever seen those big MRI machines, like this big tube that they just kind of shove you in. It used they used fMRI to show extroverts have stronger activation in dopamine-related brain regions, like the nucleus accumbens, in response to positive emotional stimuli. Extroverts have a more responsive dopamine reward system. This is what they found, meaning that they get more pleasure from novel or stimulating experiences. Introverts show lower dopamine reactivity, which makes overstimulation less pleasant and may explain their preference for calm or familiar environments. Note that this also might result in addictive behavior in extroverts, but being an extrovert doesn't necessarily make it more likely that you're going to have an addictive personality, but it could be something that's explanatory or at least correlative. If you've known someone that has an addictive personality, they get addicted to things, to the next best and greatest thing, or they're addicted to working out, or they're addicted to some other dopamine thing like doom scrolling or cigarettes or drinking or whatever it might be. You know someone that has, like, it's very easy for them to get addicted. There could be a correlation between extroversion and addictive personalities. Again, not causal, right? There's a very loose correlation between those two things, but it's a possibility. Another study, Amira in 2005 and Wright in 2006, they found measurable structural and functional differences related to personality dimensions consistent with introversion and extroversion. What does this mean? Well, it means MRI studies suggest differences in gray matter volume and connectivity patterns. Introverts have more gray matter in their prefrontal cortex, which is associated with self-reflection and planning. Extroverts have more activity in the amygdala and reward networks, social and emotional processing. And so, see, these are just some of the ways that scientific study and rigorous data has shown that indeed there are identifiable differences between the brains of someone that's very well identified as an introvert and the brain of someone that's well identified as an extrovert. In her article in Simply Psychology, Olivia Guy Evans shares what she defines as the marks of an introvert and an extrovert. These are some of the introvert stereotypes that she goes over. Things which can be certainly true of some people, but aren't true of all introverts. Signs you might be an introvert. You have a small group of close friends. You're thoughtful, which I've heard that a lot. You're a thoughtful person, so it's kind of an aspect of being an introvert. I don't really know exactly what that means, but if you're an introvert and you know what that means, like, like when she says thoughtful, does she mean like, oh, you bought someone a gift? That's a very thoughtful thing to do. Or you think about things like what kind of cup you should use for your tea, or maybe you just have thoughts. What exactly does thoughtful mean? Energized by being alone. I think that's kind of the biggest and most obvious one that people are aware of when it comes to just kind of stereotypes of introversion. Enjoy solitude. Some, but not all. I think there's a very big misconception that introverts are quiet. That's not necessarily true. That's one of the things I think I've come to know or see in introverts, is that it's not necessarily true that they're quiet people, or shy, I should say. Maybe shy is a better word. Introverts aren't necessarily shy. Like, there's a lot that they want to say, but they a lot of times just choose not to say it. And it could be for a whole litany of reasons. They tend to keep emotions private. They're quiet and reserved in large groups and around unfamiliar people. Again, there's that word quiet. It's like, yeah, they're quiet, but It's not that they have nothing to say. They feel drained by people and need privacy. And that's definitely another one that's a really big stereotype that comes to mind very quickly. Process their own thoughts in their head rather than talk them out, which means they're internal processors rather than verbal processors. Internal processors tend to need time to figure out how they feel about a situation or about a conversation or about emotion. They need to discover how they feel about it first before they share that information with someone else. Whereas external processor, verbal processors, are the kinds of people who they need to be talking about a specific thing with a person in that moment. Like they're least likely to walk away from a conflict because they need to see it resolved in person before they walk away. Because for them, when you've walked away, like there's just angst and uncomfortability if it hasn't been resolved. And there's no resolution to it if you're just by yourself. Like this, how an external processor thinks. They're more gregarious around people they know well. So people that they know really well, they can be more social. They can be more kind of lively around people that they know well. People that cost less energy to be around because they know them well enough so that they don't require as much energy to be around. Learns well through observation. These are just some of the introverted qualities that Olivia has pointed out. What about some extroverted qualities? Enjoying social settings. I agree with that. Seeking attention. Some, but not all. Just like some introverts are shy, but not all of them. Some extroverts are very attention-seeking, not all of them. Energized by being around others. Again, that's probably the most obvious stereotype that I would assume most people think of. Are friends with many people? Yes, but again, depends on what do we mean by friend? Because I would say that extroverts are really good at making acquaintances and establishing connections. They're really good at networking, I guess you could say. They're really good at networking. Realistically, I don't remember this off the top of my head. There is a limit to the amount of friends that you can have. Let's see if I can find this right now. How many friends can you have? The limit of number of friends you can have varies. Let me say, no, I don't want to know about Roblox. Give me 1 second. Why is it telling me about this Roblox thing? Okay, let's see. It's called Dunbar's number, is a suggested cognitive limit to the number of people with whom one can maintain stable social relationships. Relationships in which an individual knows each person and who they are and how each person relates to every other person. So what's that number? Let's find out what this number is. The number was proposed and could be. I'm not seeing the number. Oh, it has been proposed to lie between 100 to 250 with a commonly used value of 150. So in other words, there is a limit to the number of people that someone can actually have meaningful relationships with. And 150, that's actually kind of high, I feel like. But maybe not. Maybe I'm not sure. But friends with many people, yes, I would agree, but also to an extent, because again, there's a limit. It doesn't matter if you're an extrovert or an introvert. There's a limit to how many people you can have meaningful relationships with. And even for extroverts, there is individual limits to how many people that you can have those kind of relationships with. Sociable, I would completely agree. Sociable, outgoing, right? Sociable, outgoing, they're kind of the same. Enjoy group work. Yes, but group projects don't get any easier as an extrovert. Prefer talking over writing. Yes. Again, this is kind of like stereotypes, which means that they're true of possibly most, but not all people. It's important to keep in mind that even if you were to write a list of stereotypes, it might look different, completely different from what Olivia's list is, right? if you were to think, let's say you're an introvert, you sit down, you think of all the extroverts you've ever met, never known, and you write down a list, it might look completely different from her list. And that's okay, because every extrovert's different. Every introvert's different. It's okay that your list is going to look different. And I think that's really important, because no one fits perfectly and snugly into every single category. What you consider to be stereotypical markers will depend on the kinds of introverts and extroverts that you know and interact with. Remember, it's a scale. See, Olivia does point out that, to some degree, quote, although many people view introversion and extroversion as two opposing categories, new personality theories have come to accept that it is more likely that introversion and extroversion are on a scale. Some people may be placed more around the extroverted end of the scale or towards the introverted end, or some may fall in the middle. She also talks about an ambivert. An ambivert is a person who shows characteristics of both extroversion and introversion. In other words, they fall somewhere in the middle of the scale. She has this chart, and I just want to go over this chart like really quick. What's interesting about this chart is this is like the chart that she puts up, where she kind of talks about, like, where she's envisioning the scale that people would fall on, right? So there's extroverted, and then there's introverted, and then right in the middle is ambivert. Okay. I don't think this is a bad chart. Don't get me wrong. Like, I really don't. I don't think this is a bad chart, but I think it's somewhat missing an important key element of personality traits. Again, this is my perspective, obviously. She has an incredible perspective, and she probably knows more about the subject than I do, to be honest, but I think I would do it a little differently. Here's how I would do the personalities. I would do them like this. Rather than being like vaguely placed on either side of the spectrum and then kind of finding where you land within relationship to the middle, I would argue that people start out in the middle. Like, when you're born and you grow up, you're really young, you're a child, you don't really have as defined categories of personality as this, right? You're not born with the immediate, you're not born immediately noticeably an introvert and extrovert. Maybe you were. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some people were. But I would argue that it takes time to distinctly develop the characteristics of either an introvert or an extrovert, depending on which one you end up leaning more towards. So therefore, my argument would be that you actually begin in the middle, and as you grow up, as you change, as you socialize, especially through your teenage years, then into your young adult years, and you change and you just kind of interact with the world, and it shapes who you are, and you learn through experience, and everything comes into play. Eventually, you're going to be leaning to the left or leaning to the right, leaning to the introvert or leaning to the extrovert. But everyone starts in the middle. So I think my chart would look a little different here. That people start in the middle, and that there's more people kind of clumped towards the middle than there are in the extremities. Like, it's rare to find someone who's this extroverted, or find someone who's this introverted. And I mean, think of the most extroverted person that you could possibly ever know, like you could possibly think of. I would argue that that's not even this person. That it's more likely like this person. I think people are clumped towards the middle more than they realize. And the reason why I have this view, the reason why I have this diagram, is because I think that when we shift our perspective away from either or, like when we shift our perspective away from this polemic perspective, and we place ourselves on this very broad spectrum, I think it's easier to recognize that, okay, I, number one, shouldn't just unequivocally judge myself by one specific category, but also I shouldn't judge others by it either. Right? Because like when you're going through some phase of self-discovery, like in your early 20s or something, it can be very easy to think, oh, well, everyone has said that I'm an introvert, so I guess I'm an introvert. Like, I'm gonna do all the introvert things. In fact, this was sort of similar to what happened to me when I was like after high school and my first year of college. There was a very short period of time where I thought I had always been an introvert. That's just what I thought. I mean, I had a lot of introverted qualities when I was growing up. People would say that I was, relatively quiet when I was a kid, for sure. And so when I get to college and I'm just kind of like away from home, I'm just in a different state, I'm in a different place. I thought, like, well, I'm an introvert, so I'm just gonna like do what introverts do, and I should be happy. And it was the exact opposite, because I wasn't looking at it like this broad spectrum that every person has a bit of both in them. I wasn't looking at it like that. I was focused on the parts of me that were introvert leaning and ignoring the overwhelming part of me that's extrovert leaning. I would say that I belong maybe like there on the spectrum. I very much lean towards the extrovert than I do towards the introvert, but there are parts of me that are introverted. And I didn't consider that because I was just fixated on it's either one or the other. It's very polemic. It's this or that. So I think this kind of diagram, it's like keep it the other way. I think this kind of diagram helps us to recognize that. And it helps us to see that, wait a minute, things like personality traits especially aren't as polemic as this, that, or this, right? The Venn diagram's not a bad diagram. I mean, it's helpful for sure, but I think it's too categorical. That's my perspective. While I recognize that many people may agree with the Venn diagram conceptualization, my personal graph, would look different. So let's talk about deep thinkers for a minute, because I think that there's a distinction between deep thinkers. Well, I mean, there's an association, because a lot of people will say, well, introverts just tend to be deep thinkers. Well, remember, there's certainly a correlative relationship. They're correlated, but one does not cause the other. One's not equivalent to the other. I think many people would automatically assume that being a deep thinker is almost always correlated with being an introvert. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the best way to look at it. Rather, I would argue that deep thinking tends to be an introverted attribute that is exhibited by some people and not others. Now, why do I appreciate this wording better? Because rather than labeling someone as an introvert or an extrovert that possesses these traits, you're labeling that trait as an attribute that is possessed by some people and not others. Rather than labeling people, you're focused on defining the attribute. Very somewhat of a nuanced perspective, I'll admit, somewhat of a nuanced definition, but I think that when we focus on defining the attribute, it doesn't necessarily matter what categories of personality that they fall into. We're letting the attribute help us define the people that might possess or not possess this quality. Carl Jung saw the grayscale of personalities himself and noted that even within these two broad classifications, there's a ton of nuance. According to Jung's theory of personality, there are 4 types of introverts or extroverts. It's not just broadly extrovert. There's extroverted sensors, people who are strongly inspired by the physical world. You might know someone who loves hiking, going on adventures, living the van life or the boat life. Extroverted feelers. Those are people who enjoy listening and talking to other people. You've probably met someone who's really, really good at socializing and building relationships and listening and talking. There's extroverted intuitives. People who enjoy thinking abstractly and having deep conversations and friendly debates. And you might not think that that's an extroverted quality. Right? When you think about abstract thinking and deep thinking, you tend to think about introverts. And I think there's good reason for that. But I think we tend to think about introverts because, again, we put labels onto the personality trait rather than defining the attribute and attributing that to people regardless of their personality trait. Then there's extroverted thinkers. These are people who are goal-oriented. Those are high-achieving. They're very decisive. So there's a breadth. And there's so many different categories in introverts, too. It's such a breadth, such a wide landscape of ways in which you can exhibit and portray this personality quality. Deep thinking may be correlated with analytical intelligence, but that doesn't mean it's correlated with high overall intelligence. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to bash introverts. I know it may sound like that. I'm trying to help reshape the way that we think about these personality traits. Extroversion, for example, is more than likely correlated with a high level of social intelligence, right? Because it's easy for us to talk about intelligence and we just kind of get this idea that like, oh, he's a smart person. Well, what does that mean? Like, there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of meanings of the word smart, of the word intelligence too. It's like, if I say, oh, I believe in evolution. What do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by evolution? Are you talking about the evolution of the Ford F-150? Are you talking about the evolution of, the evolution of human civilization and society, or the evolution of culture? You're talking about the evolution of, certain creatures like the finches. What kind of evolution are you talking about? Are you talking about the evolution of the transmutation of species, or are you talking about like technology? There are so many different ways that you can use that word, and in each way it means something very slightly different. I think intelligence is a similar thing. I think we throw around the term intelligence and think that it's a status, that, oh, if this is an intelligent person, that they have this different status, they're just like a smart person, that there's just this one hierarchy of smartness and braininess and intelligence, and it's just this one hierarchy, and intelligent people are just like at the top of the hierarchy. There's different types of intelligence, and so like when we talk about introverts, I think it'd be sufficient to say that more introverts tend to be analytically intelligent than extroverts. I'd say that's a stereotype. It's something that's true of not all, but possibly true of most introverts, is that they tend to be more analytically intelligent. And that's not just based on observation, but based on some of the scientific studies that we just talked about. Higher blood flow of the prefrontal cortex. But analytical intelligence isn't the only kind of intelligence. Social intelligence is an intelligence. I mean, if you've ever met someone or just watched someone who's very extroverted, if you've watched them go to business, right? Like if you've watched them just like lock in and engage in a social setting, it's almost like a work of just like theater. Like it's right. It's almost like you're watching a show. It's like, wow. It's like this person's just like riding these conversations like butter. And if you've ever talked or been in the midst of a conversation with someone has a high level of social intelligence, it just boggles your mind how quickly they can pick up on conversational threads that lead to more conversation. And that's what a high level of social intelligence does, is they pick up on the nuances of a conversation, nuances of a person's voice, their mannerisms and demeanor, and they're able to shape the flow of the conversation as though it was like shaping the paint on a canvas. Being an introvert or an extrovert doesn't make you more or less intelligent. I'll say that again. Being an introvert or an extrovert doesn't make you more and doesn't make you less intelligent. It's what you do with that personality that defines your intelligence. I've met some pretty socially inept extroverts. Likewise, I've met some pretty not analytically thinking enough and introverts. Being a part of any of those categories, being leaning towards introvert or leaning towards, by itself, those things don't define whether or not you're intelligent. Again, correlation doesn't prove causation. It means that there's a chance that your strength is analytical intelligence, or your strength is social intelligence. But it's not like conclusive, right? It's not, it doesn't define that. Another thing that we could talk about actually is, what do unhealthy personality types look like? One of the things that I know that I've been learning a lot is what an unhealthy extrovert looks like. Now, unfortunately, I can't speak too much about what an unhealthy introvert looks like because I really don't lean very heavily towards the introvert scale. Although I'll say this is really interesting. When I was doing a search, like just like Google search, trying to find articles and trying to find blog posts about people talking about what an unhealthy introvert extrovert looks like, I found a lot that had to talk about unhealthy introverts. I did not find nearly as much as people talking about unhealthy extroverts. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe it's just the search algorithm, but I did find that interesting, that it looked like, just from doing a basic Google search, by the way, so it's not like, this is not scientifically rigorous, but it looked like there was a lot that people had to say about what it looks like when someone is an unhealthy introvert, and I didn't really see a lot of people talking about what it looks like when an extrovert is unhealthy. I don't know. But I can tell you that when an extrovert's unhealthy, it's not good. Remember when at the very beginning we were talking about those studies, and it's talking about cortical arousal, and how your cortical arousal is like your brain's just kind of base level of calmness and satiation, and just like being calm and peaceful and like satisfied, just like normal level. It's like the idleness of a car. Well, extroverts have a naturally lower cortical arousal, which means that they need stimulation in order to bring that up just to the baseline. To bring that up just to the baseline, they need some sort of stimuli, some sort of interaction. Well, when they've stopped interacting, that level goes down significantly fast. In fact, I would argue that the cortical arousal baseline level when an extrovert isn't around people goes down significantly faster than when an introvert's baseline is decreasing because they are around people. This is what I'll say. This is what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is this. From my experience and observation, when you've put an introvert into a social situation, they are immediately anxious. They immediately have anxiety, they may get stress, especially when it's around a bunch of people that they don't know. That baseline goes down, like, goes really, really far down. However, remove them out of that context. Within the span of a day, that's almost at the baseline again, or very close to being at the baseline again. From my experience, recovery is a lot more efficient for an introvert than for an extrovert. So when an extrovert is around people, they're at that baseline or higher. When they're not around people, it might decrease. I guess I'll say this because I feel like I may have confused with my language here. It might decrease slower than an introvert's decreases when an introvert is around people, but it decreases much further, if that makes sense. This is just from my observation, by the way. So there's no like, this isn't scientific or at all or anything like that. I would say that an extrovert's decrease, their baseline cortical arousal decreases, but it decreases much further, much more deeply. And I would say that I think that extroverts, there's a lot of attention and focus that's put on certain aspects of extroversion, such as like personality type. Like, oh, well, extroverts, they're always the leaders, they're always the CEOs, and The extroverts are always the people that are like leading, but like introverts they should be the leaders because they're more thoughtful and they're more analytical. So like they should really be the leaders, which I would not disagree with. I think you actually need both. But there's a lot of thought that goes into the negative sides of being an extrovert, in the sense that extroverts tend to be louder, they tend to be more seen, they tend to be more vocal, they tend to have more personality, they tend to have followings, they tend to have more relationships. And it's very easy to look at that and just try and nudge them down just a bit. Because it's like, well, they're just so full of themselves. Look at those extroverts. They're so full of themselves. They're narcissistic. Again, narcissism is more associated with extroversion than introversion. Again, it doesn't mean that everyone who is an extrovert is a narcissist. But because of that correlation, I think that we tend to focus on that negative aspect more than other things, than other aspects of what it means to be an extrovert. And perhaps that's the reason why people don't talk about what an unhealthy extrovert looks like. And trust me when I tell you, an unhealthy extrovert is unhealthy and dangerous, mostly to themselves. And so if you know an extrovert, sure, it could be hard to love them, especially as an introvert. It'd be hard to love them because they seem okay. Right? They seem to like have it all together because they always like got a smile and they're all sociable. They're like talking to everybody and they're always doing this and they're always doing that and they're always going to this event and they're always going to that event and they're like everything's, great, and they're just like so energetic, have so much life. And trust me, like when they're not healthy, things get very bad very quickly. I've learned what my personal limit is, and I've learned this on several occasions. The first time I learned it was during COVID. I cannot go longer than 3 days, like 3 full days. Not even full days, I'd probably say less than that. But I cannot go longer than 3 days without having social interaction, or I start to become afraid. I start to become unhinged. I start to lose it. And that number might look different for different extroverts, but that's what the number is for me. Love the extroverts in your life. And know that even though they seem like they're okay, it doesn't mean they are. And know that when they're like doing their thing and they're around you and talking and just like energetic, know that that's extremely important for them. That they really need that. And that if they don't have that interaction in their life, their baseline will get so low that sometimes it's hard to come back from that. So those are some of my thoughts on the question, which is better. I mean, I feel like I answered the question at the beginning, but I kind of just did a deep dive into personality traits. Honestly, the answer to the question is neither, but both. I don't think it's a cohesive question. I think it's a question that makes sense given the content of the question. It's like saying, which one's better at being a pineapple, an apple, or an orange? Well, it doesn't make sense because neither of them are a pineapple. I think that everyone's made specifically and beautifully with attributes and qualities that reflect the one who created them. And I think that Mr. Rogers has a lot of great things to say about this subject. And what was it that he would always say? He would say it at the end of every show. He would say, keep being you. And of course, there's that Dr. Seuss quote, you are you, that's truer than true. There's no one who's there's no one who's better at being you than you. I forgot the quote. But you remember the quote, I hope. Does that mean we're all just like perfect? No. I also believe that everyone's born flawed, like in the sense that we're born sinful. So our natural inclination is not towards goodness, not towards righteousness. That's not our natural inclination. Our natural inclination is towards selfishness and just wickedness and evil. right? That would be sort of a Thomas Hobbes perspective on political philosophy. So I'd argue that. So I don't believe that we're all born morally righteous and morally good, but I do believe that we're all born exactly the way that we were meant to be born, with exactly the personality and the facial features and the nose and everything. We were not an accident, in other words. There's nothing accidental about whether or not we're an introvert or an extrovert. And if you're an introvert and you feel this forlornness because, well, I wish I was an extrovert and had all those relationships that guy has, don't think of it that way. Think like, I'm an introvert. How can I leverage my introversion? How can I want to understand my introversion so much that I can leverage it to fulfill this deep longing for relationship in my life. Don't work against who you are, but work with who you are. You know, I remember coming to a point in my life where I realized something. And I realized that I am not a, what's the word I'm looking for? Systematic, like a methodical person. Like, I am not a very like structured, routine kind of person. I think the routine's the word I'm looking for. I've tried that so many times in my life. I've tried breaking out an Excel spreadsheet and literally planning out every like hour of my day, every minute of my day. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wake up, I'm going to do this at this time. And after that, I'm going to do this and this time. I am not routine. I am not that kind of person. My brain just doesn't work that way. But I tried to force my brain to be that way for so many years because I thought this is what I need to do to succeed. I have to be this routine kind of person in order to succeed, in order to have success in my life. Because if I'm not this routine person, then I'm never going to achieve any of these things. And all the people, like all of the great philosophers and the great thinkers and that I've ever read or heard about, like, they were all disciplined and routine people who woke up and kind of like had a liturgy to their day, or like just had a process that they did every single morning or every single night. Well, after so many years of trying to force myself into that kind of way of thinking and way of interacting with my life, I realized that I'm working against who I am. See, I'm not a routine person. I'm not one of those like very structured people. I'm very much like everything's just all over the place. And I realized, well, I need to learn how to use that. I need to take the way that my brain is, the way that my personality is, and I need to take that and learn how to be successful through it. See, the longer I spent trying to force myself to be something that I wasn't, to think in a way that I couldn't, to interact with the world that I couldn't, the more time I was wasting, not empowering myself to understand the way that I was made and how to use the way that I was made to achieve the things that I want to achieve. You see, structured people who are very methodical, very routine, very structured, they're really good at thinking analytically. They're really good at problem solving. Really good at it. They're really good at problem solving. They're really good at doing tasks that require systematic approach. But and you might think of, you know, people who are very routine as like think of them as like this beautiful, massive Sudoku. Have you ever seen a Sudoku puzzle? Think of them as this massive, just like 100 spaces Sudoku puzzle, and everyone's just fit perfectly. Every single number fits perfectly within the context of every other single number, and that huge. It's a beautiful thing to look at. See, but like that's goal-oriented people like me who aren't very mundane or aren't very structured and routine and just methodical. People like me who are just more of like goal-oriented rather than task-oriented. They're like a tapestry. If you've ever seen a tapestry, it's like this woven thing. It's like it's almost like a blanket, but it's not a blanket. It's almost like a blanket, but it's like a beautiful work of art that's like made from different colors of thread thread, what's it called? Made from different colors of fabric. And it paints this, like, it makes this incredible picture. Well, on the back, like the back side of a tapestry looks just like gobbledygook. Like it's all these different frayed ends of the yarn or of the like material, the textile that's being used to make the tapestry. It's all the like tied ends, it's all the frayed ends of all these like weird colors that don't make sense. It makes no sense. It looks like you're just looking at a mess. But that mess on the other side, if you go to the front of the tapestry, looks beautiful. It's a beautiful work of art. And goal-oriented people, when they're living in a healthy mindset, when they're healthy in the way that they view their goal-orientedness, they can be like that tapestry, where they're able to take what feels like and looks like just kind of a frayed mess, like just papers all over your desk. It looks like that. But when they learn how to sharpen their understanding of goal-oriented people, their understanding of that kind of personality, suddenly it begins looking like a beautiful work of art. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by it's important. There's two things. I'll say these, and then I'll be done for tonight. Two things. One, don't put people in a strict category, when in reality, most things in life are a spectrum between here and there. And that's the reason why I developed my graph the way that I developed it, because I think that people start in the middle and they just sort of lean one way or the other. But I think every person has a little bit of introvert or a little bit of extrovert, and they lean more strongly towards one or the other. These categories, these personality types, they're not definitive. There's so much beauty and so much breadth and so much just vastness in the different ways that you can be either of these things. And you are made beautifully and wonderfully for a purpose and for a reason, and there's no mistake in that. There's no mistake. Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, you were made that way for a reason, and it's not an accident. The second thing is, even though I make the argument that these things aren't that these things aren't like definitive, that there's a broad spectrum, I do think that personality traits are important to understand. Why? Because if I live my whole life trying to be an introvert, all the while being an extrovert, I'm never gonna comprehend the mistake that I'm making. I think it's important to know the differences between these categories, so you'll know, wait a minute, like, look at this personality trait. There's all these things about this personality trait. That doesn't sound like me. But here's this other one. This does sound like me. And then you'll know, okay, well, I'm going to start living like this and learn how to utilize this, because I've been doing this all wrong and I just feel like I've been hitting a brick wall. I think it was Albert Einstein that said, what's the quote? What's the quote? Hold on, now I gotta look it up. But if I live, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. That's what Albert Einstein said. And I think that hits the nail on the head. Because I do think that understanding these traits allow us to know whether or not we're a fish, and recognizing that they're not absolutely definitive and that it's a broad spectrum of differences allows us to recognize that we don't have to climb a tree. So that's it for tonight. I think we've hit the hour mark. On the dot. Look at that. On the dot. Thanks for joining me. It's been a really great dive into extroversion or introversion. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on these different personality traits and these different categories? Do you think that they're definitive categories? Do you think that they're polemic and that there's really just, they're two just like opposing personality traits and there really is no gradient in between them. What are your thoughts on the question? I would love to hear what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Let me know down below in the comments. As always, like and subscribe. It's super helpful. And I'm looking forward to next week being back for episode 19 as we continue to dive into questions. And let me know again, scan the QR code if you have a minute. Let me know if there's any questions that you would like to see on the show, or let me know if you would like to be on the show to wrestle a question with me. Thanks again for joining me. I hope you have an awesome and wonderful night, and I hope you have an incredible and blessed rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Bye.